Hallo zusammen, schön, dass so viele heute da sind. Mein Name ist Alex vom Bayerischen Basketball Verband. Ich werde heute mit meinem Kollegen Markus Grusemann das Ganze hier moderieren. Nochmal als Idee, wieso wir das Ganze machen. Also die Idee ist, wir wollen die Trainer-Community in Bayern, aber auch weiter hinaus stärken und eher zusammenholen. Der Austausch von Ideen, Philosophien, Erfahrungen ist das, was uns sehr, sehr wichtig ist. Und beziehungsweise dann daraus Kooperationen zusammenarbeiten fördern. Was ist wichtig? Und zwar, wenn ihr ein Handy habt, neben dem Laptop oder andersrum, neben dem Handy ein Laptop, dann braucht ihr das, weil wir werden Umfragen mit Mentimeter starten. Da könnt ihr auch direkt die Umfrage dann bei der Umfrage partizipieren. Das wäre erstmal der grobe Part. Euer Mikrofon ist stumm geschaltet. Wenn ihr Fragen habt, bitte stellt das im Chat. Wir werden euch freischalten und ihr könnt Alex alle Fragen der Welt stellen, die ihr haben wollt. Könnt auch gerne fragen, wenn englische Sachen nicht klar sind, dann einfach reinschauen. Wir versuchen das dann auch so schnell wie möglich euch zu erklären oder von Alex erklären zu lassen. Am besten ist, wenn das Videosharing da ist, dass ihr einmal euer Video ausmacht. Wir haben getestet, dass es zu Problemen kommen kann und ihr das nicht flüssig sehen könnt. Deswegen, wenn wir Video sharen, was Alex sehr viel machen wird, einfach Video ausmachen. Mit Fragen habe ich schon gesagt, die Coach Clinic wird aufgenommen. Ihr werdet aber nicht drauf zu sehen sein, sondern nur wir als Moderatoren oder halt Alex als Referent. Und selber filmen ist nicht erlaubt, sondern wir werden das schon online stellen und ihr könnt das danach im Nachhinein definitiv sehen. So, das war kurz zu dem ganzen Ablauf. Wir haben die große Ehre, heute Alex dabei zu haben. Hi Alex, thanks that you could make it and that you said directly, yes, I will do it. It was 10 minutes after asking you. Thanks being here and welcome.
No, danke schön, Razan. I studied German at school, but I'm not going to try to say much more, but it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks so much for the invite.
Our pleasure. Alex, I would try to ask you some questions so the people here, the coaches, know you better. The first one is, you are still a young coach, who did a lot in his life, who's seen, if we watch this picture about some of the countries you were in already, we can see that you were in a lot. So can you give us a short overview of who Alex Sarama is and what did you do until now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm 25 years old. I started playing basketball when I was 12 in my hometown, just outside London in the UK. I started my own basketball club when I was 16 years old, and it became one of the kind of top youth clubs in England, still when I was a teenager kind of running it. I read history at the University of Nottingham, and then I worked at NBA Europe from the age of 21 for 3 years. So I was based in Madrid. Really fun job. I got to literally travel the world, working with a bunch of federations, NBA players, different partners. So I did that for 3 years. I got to travel to 40 different countries through basketball. And then I spent last year at the EA program in Belgium, where I was technical director of the academy. So I did that after 3 years at the league, and now had an awesome opportunity to team up with Chris Oliver of Basketball Immersion. So Immersion is kind of regarded as the leading platform for coach education in the world. So Chris and I are now working together, just trying to share the game and share some kind of evidence-based ideas, which is what we're going to get into tonight.
Thanks a lot. The next one is we have seen a lot in the US, a lot of billboards with the presidential vote. If there would be one with you, what would it be, the quote, the Alex Sarama quote?
Absolutely. So mine would be, I'd say, incorporating evidence-based ideas to teach life lessons through basketball. So that for me gets both the coaching side of it, but then the transformational aspect and the holistic side of coaching, which is really important. And we can't neglect that, because today I'm going to focus more on the evidence of what to coach, but I think, you know, the holistic side is really important too.
Yesterday, I've seen a video. It might be some days old. I let you all seen it, and then I would ask you this question. So we've seen a great pass. Is Teodosic one example or a great example of that, what you believe in creativity? And if yes, what would be 2 or 3 key points to develop such players as he is?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I actually had this debate a couple of years ago regarding some of the stuff Luka Doncic was doing. And I think we're going to unpack that tonight. This is basically, I put this in my presentation, Razvan. It's pretty funny that you pulled the same video when we spoke about it earlier. Essentially, I think it's very difficult to determine whether you can say something like that can be developed within a practice environment because of the complexity surrounding the individual. And that means looking at Milos as a player. So yes, we can create an environment where maybe some things like this can emerge. For sure we can as a coach. And that's what I want to be sharing ideas on tonight. But at the same time, what happened when Milos was younger, you know, as coaches, we might not have control over some of the individual constraints, such as maybe he played another sport as opposed to basketball. Maybe he was playing football and he developed some really good vision and he was able to really read defenders. And maybe develop some perception from another sport helped him when it came to basketball. And there are lots of examples of this. You take Steph Curry, another famous example, obviously known for his incredible ball control. Well, actually, when he practiced growing up, he always used to play at his grandfather's house. And the surface was filled with lots of different holes and craters. So it meant the basketball used to bounce in different directions. And obviously that resulted in having some incredible ball control. So in short, I believe that yes, as a coach, we can facilitate some of these things, but there's also another layer that as a coach necessarily we can't always go into. And that's based on some more complex factors, which we'll look at today. I hope that answers the question.
For sure. Thanks a lot. And now I'm giving you... Marcus, can you give Alex the screen sharing?
Yep, Alex, you can share, and just as a reminder to click the option to optimize für Video when you're sharing the video. Und nochmal die Bitte an die ihre Kamera noch anhaben, die Kamera auszuschalten, damit wir möglichst viel Internet haben für den Alex. Danke.
Great, good stuff. Thanks, Marcus. So once again, thanks everyone for joining today. I do want to leave some time for questions. This is this is a really interesting topic, and it's been an area which I've been studying a lot over the last few years, really. So we're going to delve into it tonight. Now, I'm going to start with this. This is for any of you guys that are on basketball Twitter, as it's known. It's a great community of coaches sharing a lot of ideas. And this came up last week. And it got an incredible engagement. It was like the most liked thing I've seen on Twitter, basketball-wise, for a long time. So I'm just going to play the video. This drills are here. Now there's some film. These are some pretty double influence in here. This is obviously Holger Gershwinter, Doug's coach stuff from a clinic just on YouTube. Now, I'd like to start. I'm gonna just come out of this this presentation. One sec. I gotta stop real quick and then get it out. Now, I want you to answer the following question, and you're gonna see it right now on your Safari. And Marcus is gonna give you the code. So, drills are great for improving passing and finishing. And I just want you, Marcus, do you want to just maybe give the code for coaches so we can get the general consensus from everyone on this call?
Yep, so für alle, I'll just explain in German, für alle nochmal auf menti.com gehen und den Code habe ich jetzt gerade auch nochmal im Chat geschrieben. Dann den Code 1657697 eingeben. You just might want to refresh that, Alex. Oh, I don't want to, I hope that one doesn't influence anything, and we'll start seeing answers pop in.
Oh, just refresh.
There's some, answers are just popping in now, so yeah, you can just.
Great stuff. And coaches, please keep that up because we're going to come back to this later in the presentation too with some more interactive questions. I'm just doing this to get us thinking and really stimulate some thought here. Okay. Good. This is great. I'm going to give it another 10 seconds. Keep them coming. I'll do the last refresh right now. Last chance to cast your vote, coaches. Very, very interesting. So we had 23 going for agree, 11 disagree. Now, I'd like you to please give a rating, okay, a rating. Marcus, maybe do you want to explain this in German, or you good if I just do it in English?
Go for it. If there's any questions, people can ask in the chat.
So just a scale from not at all to very much on the right. And I just want you to please rate, coaches, the first question, how game-like do you think those drills are? That's point number one. Number two, imagine you are a player in that practice, taking part in that drill. How fun do you think that is? And then the last one, how cognitively demanding is that? That means in terms of are players making decisions? Is it difficult for the brain? So that's the last one. I'd just like you guys to please fill in on that survey. Thanks, Marcus, for helping with that. It's great.
No worries. The answers are popping in on my screen, so you can refresh in a second.
Give a couple more seconds. Okay, there we go. Very interesting. A split right in between the middle. That's great. That's just what I wanted. So this is really kind of the backbone for this presentation. And my beliefs in terms of whether those drills are useful or not, I would argue that they're completely not useful. And they have very, very, very little benefit. And that might sound surprising because those drills are typically what we see traditionally in a lot of basketball practices. And it's something a lot of very famous coaches do. And I would argue that on this scale, in terms of how game-like those drills are, I would say they're completely not game-like. Nothing game-like about them. I would say they're also not fun at all. Really not enjoyable for players. And then finally, there's no cognitive demand. Players were memorizing patterns, but they weren't learning concepts. And that's because there was no defense. So that's essentially the problem. And what we're going to look at today is some different approaches to coaching. I'm just going to start outlining the traditional approach, and then we're going to focus on the constraints-based approach, which is what we're going to spend the most time on today. So what is the traditional approach? The traditional approach is the idea that players perform one perfect movement pattern which is typically something set by the coach. So the coach typically says, okay, this is how you're going to do a right-handed layup. This is how I want you to pass in a drill, perfect chest pass. Or this is the pattern of play I want you to do and reproduce. And that's basically making an assumption. That's making an assumption that that perfect motor pattern, that technique, suits every single player. That's the assumption it makes. And typically, the traditional approach is a lot of drills where practices are very decontextualized. And what that means is it basically means that the environment that players are practicing in is completely not similar to the environment they see when they play a 5v5 game. And there are a lot of reasons which explain kind of this current predicament we're in the basketball world, and just why this traditional approach is so common. And typically it's due to the fact that a lot of the studies actually show that as coaches, we coach based on how we were coached as players. And that's certainly how I started coaching. It was all based on what I had as a player and the coaching I had. And this is known as the custodial effect, where this never-ending cycle keeps going on. And even though it could be 40 years ahead, the same practices are repeated over and over and over again. And there's a great saying from the medical profession, and it's to do with surgeons. And you know, if you were a surgeon in the medical field and you were still doing the same things that you did 5 years ago, you would actually be sued for malpractice, and maybe you'd be put into jail. But as basketball coaches, sometimes we're doing things from 35 years ago exactly the same, without taking into understanding the complexity of the game and all the evidence that we now have available to us as coaches in regards to how people learn. And this is really important, because when we understand the evidence and we know how people learn best, it makes us better basketball coaches at the end of the day. So that's the traditional approach, also known as the reproductive style. Now, before we get into the constraints-based approach, I'm just going to give you a very, very, very quick oversight into skill acquisition and the basics of skill acquisition. Now, three terminologies, three key words I've put on here: motor behavior, motor performance, motor learning. I recommend just taking a photo of this on your phone, because I'm going to refer back to it later on in the presentation. And after, it's really good just to really be clear with what these terms are. I'm just going to unpack them a little bit more for you. So a motor behavior, motor basically means movement. So a motor behavior is, let's say we're looking at a basketball player, it's their ability to perform a particular technique. So this could be something such as dribbling or shooting. It's their ability to perform that movement pattern. That's motor behavior. Now, the motor performance is typically what we see in our practice sessions as coaches. And that is a short-term shift in terms of us as coaches watching that skill, that technique being done. So let's say, for instance, we're doing some dribbling, all right, in a practice. Right? We're doing some dribbling drills. Well, the motor performance would be what we feel as coaches, what we see during that practice or immediately after it. And then the most important one is the motor learning. And this is the one which is neglected the most with the traditional approach to coaching. And this is seeing permanent changes in motor behavior, and we see that technique being retained over and over again. All right, now I'm going to just lead on to the next slide, because this links into that between in terms of motor performance, motor learning. Now, we got two things here: blocked practice, random practice. And blocked practice is exactly what we saw in those drills, which I showed you guys. And that was where a technique was repeated over and over and over again. And there was very little, if any, variation, because the coach said, this is the movement I want you to do, reproduce this movement, go, do the drill. And all the evidence shows, and this goes back 30 years based on skill acquisition professors and academics, practitioners, that block practice is very limited in leading to the long-term motor learning that we looked at. And it's the random practice, which is the type of practice which leads to transfer in the game and leads to skills being retained over time. And random practice is where a skill is practiced in a more random manner. So the same movement is not repeated over and over again. There could be some variation. And typically skills are mixed. So as opposed to just doing something like passing, like we saw in those drills, maybe there's passing, finishing, and even some shooting within the same activity. And that's where the small-sided games that we're going to look at today, well, small-sided games and playing against live defenders, that's what results in the random practice. And it's traditionally these drills, these old-school drills, which are blocked practice and has a very, very, very limited effect when it comes to long-term transfer. Now, when it comes to, I speak to coaches a lot about these two terms, and it can sometimes be very difficult as a coach to embrace and adopt a practice where you see a lot of randomness. Because what random practice looks like in context, and we're going to look at these videos tonight, is a lot of mess. Players make a lot of mistakes. It's not neat. It's not perfect. And as coaches, we've got to be comfortable with that mess. So that's one of the challenges with this approach. Now, what is a constraints-led approach? This is also known as something called ecological dynamics. And this is basically the idea that humans are really, really complex beings, which is true. And what that means in coaching, well, the constraints-led approach is basically the idea that skill emerges, skillful behavior. Take, for instance, that pass that we saw Teodosic do. Skill emerges from these three constraints being present. And we've got three types of constraints, three categories, sorry. The first type of constraints we have are player, individual constraints. And these kind of combine to form a triad. Then we have environmental constraints, and then finally task constraints. Now, this might sound a bit confusing. We're going to unpack that in greater detail over the next few slides. So what do I mean by individual constraints? Well, the reason the traditional approach is so flawed, where coaches demonstrate one perfect movement, which they want players to do. Maybe that's finishing, showing one movement pattern, or maybe it's how to come off a pick and roll. I don't know. It could be anything. The problem is it doesn't take into account that every player is different due to the following reasons you can see on your screen. And these are just a bunch of constraints I came up with the other week. And I don't think it's definitely not all inclusive. There are certainly some other things which I haven't put on here, but these were the main ones that I came up with. And body size. So the height, you can see that great example on the left, Manute Bol, and then smallest player of all time who I actually did an NBA clinic with at 5'3". And constraints means what works for one player is not necessarily going to be the same for the other. Then we got genetics, some things you may be born with. Fitness, obviously some of these are variable, some are fixed. Puberty, very important for the youth coaches. Maybe you have a tall player who's really going through a growth spurt. It's going to affect his coordination. Then we've got mental skills, perceptual skills, and personality. And it's very important as coaches that we are self-aware of all these individual constraints. And I'm going to show you how they can interact with the whole pyramid of constraints later on in this presentation. Now, environmental constraints, the second category. I'm here in Sweden right now. I'm doing some work with the Federation, which is really fun. We're designing a new curriculum, basically all based on this constraints approach. And it's really exciting because I believe it's the first national federation in the world in terms of basketball who have actually completely adopted and embraced the constraints-led approach, which is great. Now, this is a great example of an environmental constraint. This was on my morning walk, and I just saw close to where I was staying this hoop with all the bikes here. Well, this is obviously going to lead to different skills emerging if a player is practicing on this. They might not be able to shoot because if they shoot, if it's a rebound, it might go on the bikes and break them. It means they're probably going to take a lot of right-handed layups. So that's something which is going to shape what skills occur due to the environment and because of these physical barriers. Now, some other things we have here. Temperature and humidity. That's, and these environmental constraints, it's not the one as coaches. A lot of these we don't have as much control of, some we do, but that would be more, say, for like a FIBA game. Imagine Germany are playing, maybe they're going to a world championship in a really hot country. Maybe they've got to take into account that temperature and humidity in their prep, because that's a significant constraint. Altitude, best example is the Denver Nuggets in the NBA. They play at thousands of feet above sea level. And that's obviously a constraint. Lighting, court surface, sound baskets. Now the baskets, that's probably the best example you guys will be familiar with. Just think this photo on the right that I put in. And that's where in Europe we're so much more advanced than the US, where they still have a lot of 10-foot baskets. Well, if a young player is shooting on that 10-foot basket and they're really young and they don't have the strength to get it up, it's really going to damage their long-term technique. And they're going to have to self-organize down to figure out a way to shoot on that basket. So some of these, like I say, we can adapt. So as opposed to having that 10-foot basket, it's an 8-foot basket for mini basket. That's an example of an environmental constraint. So when you hear me talk about environmental constraints tonight, this is what I mean. And the last things are social constraints. And these environmental constraints are really either physical or social. And that could be a cultural norm. For instance, where I grew up in England, the norm is to play football. It's not really to play basketball. So that might affect participation. But then you've got more important things, like maybe if a kid comes from a family where in that culture academics are really, really prioritized, well, they're going to have less time for basketball practice. That's a constraint. And you can just see there some of the other factors I put down, including family and friendship groups. That's really, really key. Now, the big one. This is the most important category because as coaches, it's the one we can manipulate and experiment with and change the most to lead to skills happening. And this is what I referred to when Razvan showed that Milos Teodosic pass. It's these which we can manipulate to lead to really creative behaviors emerging. So the first one is, well, as part of coaching with a constraints-based approach, it means you're going to play a lot of small-sided games. That means could be anything from a 1v1, 2v1, even 5v5, in my opinion, is more of a small-sided game. So the aim of the small-sided game, and that could be whether it's to score a basket or maybe just to get the ball to a particular area. Maybe you're playing touchdown. Well, that's an example of a task constraint. Then the equipment you're using, whether you're using basketballs or maybe you're using training props. Size of the area which you play in. You might constrain the size of the court. Maybe you're playing on the half court only. Maybe you're playing on half of the half court. It depends. Time. Maybe you're using time and score, giving players a certain amount of time to come up with achieving the task of that small-sided game. Scoring system and points. You might overvalue or devalue things. For instance, a lot of my practices, I would devalue a mid-range shot and make it worth 1 point because of everything we know in regards to points per possession. Well, that's a great example of a constraint. Player numbers, the amount of numbers we put in the small-sided game, whether, like I said, it's a 3v3 or a 3v2, whatever. So these are the things we're going to look at the most tonight. How can we manipulate these task constraints to lead to skill emerging? Now, this is a great diagram which kind of makes it a little bit easier to understand this concept of a constraints-based approach. And this comes from a guy called Mark O'Sullivan. I've been fortunate to spend a lot of time with him this week here in Stockholm. And he's the head of the AIK Football Academy here in Sweden, one of the biggest clubs. And he's a world leader in this idea of CLA, constraints-led approach. And this is this comes from obviously football, but this is a great diagram to consider when you're designing your practices. Do you have these 4 things in this cycle? So that means firstly, is everyone active? And then do you have these 4 things? An opponent, a ball, a direction, and a consequence. And if you do, that means you're probably going to be coaching within this framework, which is awesome stuff. So small-sided games. An SSG basically stands for small-sided game. That's something you might see a lot nowadays. And these are really, really important because they provide players with affordances. An affordance is an opportunity for action. So what I mean by that is, say, for instance, you take a 2v2 versus a 5v5. In the 2v2, it's common sense that the affordances are much greater due to the smaller amount of players. So it gives more opportunities for players to develop skill. So coaching with small-sided games is a key part of a constraints-based approach. But it doesn't necessarily mean if you set a small-sided game up, let's say you set up a 2v2, I don't know, in the half court. If you just let the players play, maybe you constrain the area, so you give them half a court to play in. Maybe you do give them a scoring system, okay? So you are applying some constraints, but you're not really manipulating a lot of the specific constraints we're going to get into. So coaching with a constraints-based approach, it's not just a question of coming up with some games and putting players in games. It's really, how do you add and distort and play around with all those three constraints to lead to the good stuff happening. So now we're going to, just for the rest of this presentation, we're going to be looking at really in-context examples, because I really want to bring the science of this to life and make it really easy to understand. So this is called a rondo. And when I spoke to Razvan and Marcus, we spoke about showing some constraints-based ideas which you can really use to develop passing and finishing skills. So this is really good as a warm-up, or I also do this pre-game as a pre-game warm-up. Now, this comes from football, from Barcelona. They do this a lot. So they can't move, so the constraint, that's a task constraint, they can't move, with two defenders in the middle. Obviously, I've manipulated the size they are playing in, and with a lot of these small-sided games, you'll see the same constraints lead to similar things. For instance, making it bigger, making this playing size bigger, would make it easier for the offense. Why? Because it's a constraint which leads to them having more time and space on the ball. Likewise, making it smaller makes it harder. So a lot of these constraints are similar. Now, all this is the players have 2 seconds on the ball to make their pass. So if they freeze and they hold it longer than 2 seconds, they become the defender. Or if the defense manages to steal or touch the basketball, they also swap in and have to constraint. Now, a game's approach would be if I just set this rondo and it's like 4v2 and I don't really manipulate many constraints and I just say play, go. And I don't add any changes and they just do this for 10 minutes. So that would be more of a traditional teaching games for understanding, which came out in the 1960s, where a lot of practitioners in Australia and the UK. But it's the
Alex, sorry to interrupt. It's as we feared, I guess because we've got a lot of participants, the audio is not coming through when you're playing the video. So we'll have to revert to plan B.
Okay. Or I could play it, pause, and talk. Would that make a difference?
Yeah, that would make it so when you're pausing the video, we can hear you. So if you can do that, then that would be the easiest option. And if it's still the quality doesn't pick up, then we'll have to switch. But let's try that first. Just pause it when you're talking and then let the video run. And then that seems to be working so far.
Sounds good.
Thanks.
Pleasure. So there you could see kind of just the setup. And to begin with, I just get them going with that small-sided game, and then I start to add loads. So loading is basically manipulating constraints. I could also deload, which is taking a constraint away. So now what I've added is a constraint where players have to pass and receive the ball rooted like a tree. I like to use lots of external cues. So as opposed to me saying, don't see there on the right, I give them the positive alternative, which is passing, receiving, rooted. And this is because skill is not just always the addition of something, but also the elimination of something. And if players are able to catch and pass the ball without twisting, without moving their feet, you get the ball quicker from A to B. And think about the context of that, particularly with a player on the perimeter if they're making an extra pass. If they can make an extra pass without moving, without twisting, how much more effective and efficient is it going to be getting to the receiver? So this is an example of a task constraint that I have added now within this. So let's just play this, take a look. Now, you might have noticed two very skillful things happened. And like I said, I did not teach it. This did a no-look pass. This player did a touch pass where he didn't even catch the basketball. And that is the magic of why I've become so, the more I coach with this constraints-based concept and I see stuff like this happening, you really get to see how effective it is. And it's showing repetition without repetition. The players aren't doing the same pass every time, chest passes, whatever. They're doing different passes to solve the problem, which is to keep the balls away from the defenders. Let's see a few more. So you can see now I said every pass had to be like a hot potato, another external cue, where they're touching it, they're not catching it. So again, leading is happening. And as I'm doing this, guys, I really encourage you to think of your own loads. And we're going to actually do that in a second. I want you to think, what are some different constraints you could potentially add to this to lead to different things and different solutions taking place? Let's just watch one more. Now adding in some pass and cut. They have to exchange bases after every pass. That's another great example of a constraint. What we're going to do is I'd like you guys to just take that idea of a rondo our app right here, and I want you to think about individual constraints. So those are the things we looked at on that first slide. I'm just going to get it right back up as a refresher. So these. Now, I talked a lot about the task constraints within that, but I just want you to think, how could some individual constraints within this rondo, with these players in particular, lead to different things happening? It's a challenging question, but I want to see if anyone can type it in. So it's going to be in box format, so you can type whatever answer you want, and then we'll take a look at them. I'm going to give you guys 1 minute to do that.
Also zur Erinnerung auf menti.com und der Code ist 1657697.
User. As we do. Okay. Good stuff. Oh, some of these things I really like. I like that first one, adding a second ball in. I actually did that the other day. It didn't work very well on the 4v2, but when I did it 5v3, it worked awesomely. But some of these would actually be more examples of task constraints, okay? But these are awesome task constraints, and I love this passing only with the weak hand, only low looks. So these are some really good things. Catching the ball on one leg. So awesome stuff. This is really good stuff. But these are more, I want in that Rondo, you had Dennis Schroeder and Daniel Tice playing in the Rondo. So the individual constraints are just things, obviously you can't really control that as the coach, but what you can do is ensure that players frequently in practices play against different people. Because imagine that Daniel Tice is in the middle of that Rondo, guys. Well, the passes, if they're always over the top, they're probably going to be picked off because he's a big dude. Whereas if Schroeder's in the middle, players are going to be able to make lob passes a greater success. So that's something really simple. But by understanding that as coaches, it means that when we see things like that, we understand how the skills can emerge. And obviously there are other things in this. For instance, Schroeder's a lot quicker. So maybe he can move a lot faster in that Rondo to pick off a pass. So maybe that means that passes need to be much quicker as opposed to being loopy like a rainbow. So these are just some examples of how the individual constraints in terms of who is actually there within your small-sided games impact skills which happen. And the reason I put this in is because a lot of the times in practice, I see a lot of players only going against the same guys, playing against the same player in a one-on-one or playing always with the same teammates. And it's so important to mix this up and be variable because say, for instance, something like pick and roll. Well, someone like Daniel Tice is a agile screener. He can really get downhill, fast roll pretty quickly. And that's why the Celtics did a lot of the screen to drop stuff with him last year. Whereas maybe if you're playing with a much heavier, slower center, maybe someone like Dirk Nowitzki, who's a pop guy, well, you've got to know your personnel. So this is why in your practices, having enough individual constraints are really important. Yeah.
Alex, a reminder, we can't hear you when the video is running. Alex, can you hear me?
I skipped this one, but a lot of those ones came up with were really good examples of task constraints. Now, I want to get through as many small-sided games as I can in kind of the next 2025. This is a great example of this is something really good for UC. If the coach yells switch, the team have to, instead of attacking the basket they're facing, have to change direction. So what that constraint leads to is advantage. So now can these players situation where the 2-on-1 is very scripted? Say for instance, I don't know, 3-man weave into a 2-on-1 back. Even though that's somewhat random and there's a live defender, it's not very random because the players are always in perfect spacing going in the same angle. Whereas this is something which leads to a lot more randomness.
Alex, can I just interrupt you there for a second?
And you might have noticed there, we also added the constraint that all passes now, what you outlet, and this was actually a constraint. This was me manipulating the score. So you can use constraints to encourage tactical behaviors too. Now, as a team, as an under-16 team, this is my club in Italy, we want them to play very fast, getting a very quick inbound, and really just putting pressure, trying to get a clapback as soon as we can. So a clapback is basically, can we get a score within 3 seconds? It's like imagine you're in a playground and maybe at school, and someone gives you an insult. Well, instantly you want to clap back immediately, and it's the same on a score. So the constraint was if you manage to score off an assist where you take 1 or 2 dribbles off the inbound catch, you get 5 points. So that again is of manipulating constraints.
Alex, can I just interrupt you? Can you hear me? Alex? That's probably because he's showing the video.
Now, if you noticed on that one, the player used a one-footed, one-step-and-up finish. Same hand, same leg. We didn't teach that. And this, again, is the problem with when we as coaches teach very traditional movement patterns and we say, oh, you must do your layup left, right, up. Well, that's robbing players of a chance that they have to develop something that actually might be a great solution for them. This one. So the constraint was, if it was an advantage situation, it had to be a score off an alley-oop. And that was just something fun. We put it in for fun. But look at the creativity that occurred as a result of that.